Hello everybody and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Our guest is Dr Philippa Whitford, who, as I'm sure you'll all know, until very recently was a SNP MP. Philippa's a recently retired breast surgeon as well, has lived in Gaza. We have covered a presentation that she gave on her work in Gaza last year, and it's still so topical and the situation is so fluid that we asked Philippa to give us an update of where she sees the situation now. We're delighted that she was able to do that.
Yes, when you're speaking with someone who has a much fuller sense of the situation on the ground, by which I mean a much fuller sense than you get from the media in this country. She's got the background knowledge of having lived there, knowing the people, especially knowing the hospital situation, and the hospitals have all gone now. They've all been targeted. Yes.
So without any further waffling from us, let's welcome Philippa into the studio.
Where do we start to talk about this?
I think that is the challenge. I mean, where do we start? You know, I'm somebody who doesn't tend to give in to despair. You know, I think if something's wrong, get up and fix it rather than moan about it. But really, some of the things we're looking at in the world, particularly what's fed by Trump and what's specifically in Gaza, and we mustn't forget the West Bank, are kind of really quite overwhelming at the moment. I mean, when I gave that talk to Christians for Independence, so that was kind of, well, approaching a year ago now, the degree of destruction, the degree of displacement of people, and of course that has just gone on and on. There's probably, I can't imagine that there's an undamaged building left in the Gaza Strip anywhere. But what we know that happened from last October was this attempt to literally just clear the land in northern Gaza, which is just north of Gaza City. And we've just seen destruction of everything. I mean, all 12 universities are gone, including 2 medical schools. There isn't a single undamaged hospital, but many of them are not even able to function at any basic level whatsoever. And so one of the most appalling things in Gaza has been the attacks on civilians, the attacks on civilian infrastructure, all of which are not allowed under international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and the rules of war. You know, after the Second World War, there was a recognition of the appalling things that were done, particularly to the Jewish people with the Holocaust, but also to other communities and to civilian populations. And it wasn't meant to be never again for Jewish people. It was meant to be never again for anyone. And unfortunately, I think one of the big casualties of what's happened over the last 16 months is the complete destruction of international humanitarian law itself. You know, including our UK government, but particularly America, Germany, and others, in defending the indefensible, they have undermined international law, international order. And that puts at risk literally anybody on the planet in the future. If we're moving to a time, and obviously this is flagged up a bit by some of Trump's spoutings, that just might is right, then that's actually a very scary world. And that is a bit overwhelming and a bit difficult to sort of deal with at the moment. But I think even just taking that time, I mean, what happened on the 7th of October was an atrocity, 7th of October 23. And there's no getting away from that. And, you know, you can't undermine the humanitarian sympathy for bereaved families in Israel or hostage families in Israel who've wondered if their loved ones are alive. You know, either you're humanitarian or you're not. If you only think that one death counts and another death doesn't, then you're not a humanitarian. But what we have seen in our media and our politics is a recognition of the Israeli deaths on the 7th of October and IDF casualties in Gaza, but a complete minimization or dismissal of the slaughter of tens of thousands of Gazan civilians over the last 6 months.
Indeed, and you sent us more recent photos taken in Gaza.
Yeah, this is Shifa Hospital, which was the main hospital in Gaza City, the biggest hospital in the Strip. Obviously, we had all the claims of there was a control center underneath. There was a basement. This was an Israeli hospital. They built it in 1983, and they built it with a basement. So of course there were structures on satellite imagery or radar, etc., but they never produced any real evidence suggesting that this was the control center for Hamas, and yet it's been completely destroyed. And I don't even see how you can make many of these buildings safe. I mean, this one is just simply, this was someone who worked for me on my team in 91, Omar, he's a consultant in East Jerusalem, and this was his grandmother's house, traditional Gazan house, absolutely beautiful.
Beautiful.
But if you see the picture of it now, just rubble. And this is what Gaza looks like. But this is what you see. As I say, there's mosques, there's churches, there's the universities, the library and archive of history in Gaza, all of these things destroyed. So culture, knowledge, learning, massively destroyed. And this is a picture from when Ahli Arab Hospital was hit by the rocket on the 17th of October in 23. And I was actually, because it's breast cancer month, I was just about to start a live webinar with Al Ahli regarding the breast cancer project that I helped set up in 2016. And it was only when I had joined the webinar that they told me what had happened. And obviously this was being streamed, and I had to get through that hour with no idea whether friends and colleagues had survived. Of course, we were not linked with Ahli because this had just happened. And while there was all the, oh no, this was a misfire of a Hamas rocket or whatever else, there's lots of skepticism on both sides as to exactly what it was. But it did result in hundreds of deaths and casualties. So it was incredibly destructive. And what we had at that time was, oh no, it was definitely not Israel. We don't attack hospitals. That was the defense at that time. Whereas actually when they invaded in 2014, they invaded through El Wafa Hospital, which was a head injury and spinal hospital. And they left nothing but sand and rubble. So this idea that, the IDF would never attack a hospital. Of course, the last 16 months have disproved that. But also the other narrative of it all started on the 7th of October. The people of Gaza have been locked in Gaza for 17 years. Patients not allowed to go to Jerusalem for cancer treatment, for radiotherapy, drugs, difficult to get in, difficult to get medical supplies. People, even children being sent up to Jerusalem, their parents not allowed to go with them. So Gaza has been under blockade for 17 years and obviously has been occupied since 67. And the people who are the 1948 refugees within Gaza were driven there in 1948 when 750,000 Palestinians were displaced out of what has become Israel. And obviously, we're now talking about people being displaced out of Gaza altogether. I mean, it's just unimaginable that we have allowed this kind of atrocity and these kinds of atrocities to go on and on into the 21st century. And if you lock people in a pressure cooker, is it altogether surprising that there will eventually be a violent explosion, which is what the 7th of October was? I mean, I'm not justifying it. I've never been a friend of Hamas. But the idea that what existed on the 6th of October was peace, because people say that, oh, there was a ceasefire on the 6th of October. You had peace on the 6th of October. No, you didn't. You had people trapped under blockade, and it impacted on every single aspect of their lives.
Yes, that 7th of October, I mean, certainly it's an atrocity. It just sent shockwaves in itself around the world. Of course, Hamas would have known that there was going to be a retaliation from Israel once they did that. Do you think that even they thought it would be to the extent that it has been?
I'm not sure that they would have. The worst of the previous invasions, and Gaza has been either bombed or invaded every few years since 2006, when Hamas came to power, when they were initially elected, and then they drove Fatah out and seized power completely. So You know, we had the bombings of 8/9, 2012, there were 2 attacks, 2014, the big one. So mostly at that time, 2014 was the worst, and that was just over 2,000 deaths. And here we have, you know, approaching 50,000. With the disappeared, they're saying it's already over 60,000, and others are estimating it's actually higher than that. And that is only people who died directly from trauma. That's not the people who couldn't get insulin. That's not the people who died of a wound infection. It's not the people who died of untreated heart disease. This is only the direct deaths from the war. So I'm not sure they would have been prepared for quite the scale that it was. I think what drove it was Saudi Arabia was planning to normalize relationships with Israel without an agreement regarding Palestine and Palestinian sovereignty. And so I think there may have been a degree of, we have nothing to lose. If another one of these Abraham Accords goes ahead and it is just cemented in that the Palestinians are either displaced or driven out or remain under occupation and blockade, then there is no future for us. So I think a combination of probably underestimating the response and also, you know, just desperation. And equally, the Israeli government, which is of course really quite extreme in playing to the Israeli public, kept talking about the hostages. The biggest return of hostages was the ceasefire of November 23. And the hostages that have been returned through military engagement has been, you know, single figures, and often at an enormous cost of Palestinian deaths, but also including hostage deaths. So, you know, negotiation was always the way to get hostages back. And that has never been the #1 priority of this Israeli government. And, you know, it's clear from the things they've been saying right from the start that they saw this as an opportunity to clear Gaza out and go back to occupation, full occupation and settlement. I mean, when we lived there, my husband and I, as you know, worked there in 91 and 92, just after the first Gulf War and during the first Intifada, we still had settlements in Gaza. They only withdrew in 2005, and it was under the direct control of the IDF. So, you know, clashes, young people being shot, all of these kind of, you know, that was happening all the time when we lived there. But what we didn't face was the kind of bomb blast injuries and crush injuries that colleagues in Gaza will have been dealing with over the last 16 months. And obviously what they've had to deal with is horrific. It's almost beyond our imagining, because if you're watching the BBC or STV or whatever, you're getting quite a sanitized image. You will see children covered in cement dust. You will see rubble. You might get a hint that there's a body somewhere. If you're watching Al Jazeera or if you're watching what people are sharing directly, you will see the true horror of what's been happening to civilians in Gaza.
That has been quite a feature as well of the mainstream media coverage. The language that they use is very, very, well, biased is the only word that comes to mind. Marlene and I took part in the demonstration in Glasgow against BBC Scotland's coverage.
It was quite a rally. It was very powerful. And Fiona went on the march. I just went straight to BBC, and you know, they had this huge Palestinian flag.
It's been a feature of all of the media. You know, Israelis were murdered or slaughtered. We had descriptions of, here are 3 teenagers who were killed in Gaza, without mentioning that, yeah, they're actually IDF soldiers, and yet describing literally children in Gaza as a young woman or a young man kind of thing. You know, we have one side died, the other side murdered. You know, this slanting, this framing has happened in virtually all media coverage. Yeah. As ever, Channel 4 a little bit better than the others, but it's really been there all the time in all of the media, diminishing literally slaughter that has been going on in Gaza. And obviously many people who've been paying attention have started to see through that.
Yeah, I
Do you
think Westminster as well. So the language being used by some of the current government, Starmer. And
Well, obviously it started with Starmer's, yes, Israel has the right to turn off, power and water and food right at the start in his LBC interview. And then you saw the fight that we had in Westminster to try and allow a vote on the ceasefire. So we had an amendment in the King's speech in November 23, which not that many were brave enough to vote for. And then when we brought the opposition day to actually have a vote on a ceasefire, we saw that appalling finagling between Labour and the Speaker to steal the opposition day and allow a Labour vote first that had some wishy-washy, I call it a word salad. I was unfortunately unable to be in Westminster for most of that year, because I spent kind of a year from September 23 on crutches and just couldn't have traveled to London. And it was so frustrating watching it on the television, as probably the only MP who's ever lived in Gaza, and to listen to the euphemisms. David Lammy kind of saying it's not a genocide until 1 million people have been killed. Well, what about Srebrenica? We don't say that wasn't, that undermining of international humanitarian law, I think, is one of the most shocking things of this. And the problem is that lays down an appalling legacy for the future, which is, well, Putin's okay because might is right. There are no rules of engagement. If you've got the power to invade a neighbor, that's okay. And we have, the UK government have supported that and fed that and undermined that rules-based order. And I have to say, I was very proud of Humza as the first Western leader on the 10th of October to say we need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire in Gaza.
Yes.
And boy, did he get criticised for it.
Oh, yes.
All over, So do you think that language that we've heard coming from Westminster, obviously some other countries as well, but certainly from Westminster, do you think, is that linked up with the fact that Britain provides arms for Israel? It wasn't that long ago that there was a Foreign Office, fairly senior civil servant at the Foreign Office, resigned because he was being asked for reports about the situation in Gaza. He was, being honest about it, and then he was being told to tone that down a bit. And his only conclusion was tone it down a bit because we're going to carry on sending arms. And of course, you're not meant to supply arms if there's someone breaking international law. Absolutely,
and there was a committee that is meant to review things like arms export licenses. I know that arms companies have often been a target for protesters, and sometimes obviously quite with destruction of property or whatever, and I totally understand that. But we do have to remember that when we think about Ukraine and sending arms to Ukraine to help them defend themselves against Russia, suddenly we think, well, actually, that's good. Those weapons or equipment are useful. It is a government who is meant to say, I'm a pacifist anyway, so I'm not hugely into that, but we do have wars and we do have situations where you have to defend yourself. We would never imagine an independent Scotland without a defence force. So you will have arms, but you are meant to have a strict control of where they're sold. And in the past, they would have had a committee doing that, which was disbanded. And although this government have now taken away about 30 out of 350 licenses, the kind of F-35 parts, those are the planes that are dropping the bombs. And so there's no significant withholding of arms or embargo on arms from the UK. And that, combined with the kind of language that always is defending the Israeli stance, no matter what they're doing, ethnic cleansing, using starvation and the withholding of fuel and power, the withholding of medical supplies, all of these things are against international law. And yet the UK government was utterly unwilling to criticize them and is therefore complicit in what has happened in Gaza, as indeed are many Western governments. And therefore they have lost all moral authority to challenge some of the big beasts across the world that could pose a threat to smaller neighbors, whether that's Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, or others. We ourselves have defended the indefensible, and therefore we've undermined that international order, and we have lost the right to criticize others. And you have to consider, where is that? Is it the huge amounts of money that were donated to the Labour Party for the election from Israeli businesses and donors? Is it just the profit from the arms companies? Exactly why is there that stance on one side? I mean, it's just shameful. And
it is. It's shameful, isn't it?
I'm very ashamed of Westminster and how they have behaved in the face of just an appalling humanitarian situation.
Yeah, I'm ashamed of the Labour Party. I mean, it's a long time since I voted for the Labour Party, but I did vote for them for quite some while. And the way that they've behaved through this, and so even before October 23, there's been these years of argument about somehow if someone criticises the Israeli government, that's called out as being anti-Semitic. I mean, I just never understood. Of course, Corbyn got caught up in that, but he's been a critic of the Israeli government for a long time. But the idea that somewhere you can't criticise a government without being condemned as saying something that's racist, that hasn't helped this whole sort of intertwining tendrils that we're caught up in, I think.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, it was very striking after Corbyn was in essence brought down by the accusations of anti-Semitism. Now, there was anti-Semitism within the Labour Party.
Yeah.
When I heard Labour MPs talking about some of the abuse they were getting and how slow the party was to deal with that, I mean, I was shocked at what was happening to some Jewish Labour MPs, and that is appalling, and it had to be dealt with. But what it also did, just as you say, if you even criticise the Israeli government, which anyone has the right to do, to criticize any government, and certainly any politician has the right to do, you are immediately accused of anti-Semitism. And what you could see in Westminster is there were a handful of Labour MPs who, had been very active on this issue for years, who remained committed, who remained part of our cross-party groups. I was part of 2 cross-party groups, one internally within Parliament and one that also involved NGOs, non-governmental organisations, charities and so on. We would meet regularly. And what you saw is that in debates, it would now only be the very committed voices on both sides of the argument who would turn up. And MPs who were not so committed would just run a mile. It was I'm not getting involved. Some of that a bit has changed because in their postbags, MPs will have been getting lots of emails and letters from constituents. But I know, having done so many talks and given interviews in the past when I was an MP, if you put your head above the parapet, you will inevitably be accused of anti-Semitism. And I'm sorry, I would be attacking any government that had done Gaza. I'm certainly very critical of Biden's government, and I'm going to be even more critical of Trump's government. So this is not about a government being of a Jewish state. As I said, it was meant to be never again, not just never again for Jewish people, but they're allowed to do it to other folk. 7th of October was an atrocity, but countering one atrocity with another atrocity doesn't actually get us anywhere other than into the abyss.
I was going to ask about Netanyahu and the fact that he was, well, what exactly did happen? The UN outlawed him or given some kind of sanction, and yet we've just seen pictures of him standing happily next to Trump in the White House. And I was under the impression that his status now was that if he turned up in Britain, he would be immediately arrested. Have I got that wrong?
It wasn't the UN, it was the International Criminal Court, the ICC, that put out an arrest warrant for him. Now, neither Israel nor America recognized the ICC because America knew that with some of their international behavior, there would have been a chance of their military or others being taken in front of it. They both are signed up to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And of course, that's the one that put the provisional measures out last January, saying that there was evidence of a plausible genocide, and these are the changes that should be made. And none of them made any of the changes or did anything to protect civilians. But it's the ICC. But what you see is, you saw Britain and others saying, oh yes, we support the ICC, but then starting to look for loopholes and say, well, yes, but he is a head of state and yada, yada, yada. So even from the countries that said we will abide by the ICC, you have seen some of them wiggling to allow him. But America doesn't recognize the ICC. That's a simple fact. But we know that Netanyahu was, he was very much, you can almost say, a supporter of Hamas. It was seen as a technique of divide and conquer, was to help drive Fatah out of Gaza, which allowed Hamas to take control. There are recordings of him saying, if you want the greater Israel, you have to put up with Hamas, because this is how we do it. There are certainly, videos showing him talking about, at some point we will find an excuse, we will drive the Palestinians out of Gaza. And so I think he will have taken this proposal to Trump, and of course Trump is going along with it. He just sees it as a property deal,
exactly.
Building waterfronts. If you remember, it's now, I can't remember, is it about 3 years ago, roughly 3-4 years ago, when Netanyahu had announced they were going to annex the whole West Bank. If you buy a map of Israel in Israel, it doesn't show the West Bank. There's no green line. And it's illegal to publish a map that shows the West Bank demarcated. And of course, with Smotrich in control in the West Bank, they were already changing the kind of courts, which were, because it's an occupied territory, if you arrested someone, they were actually tried in military courts, including children. But then it was going to be, it's going to be Israeli courts in the West Bank. And this was being sold as, isn't this an improvement because it's not a military court? But you are not allowed to change the law in an occupied land to be your law and your institutions, in the same way as you are not allowed to transfer your population to live in occupied territory, such as the settlements. Michael Gove's anti-boycott bill that was challenging pension funds, businesses, local authorities from doing business with companies in occupied territories. That isn't boycotting. Making profit or business in an occupied territory is illegal. So actually, they're just doing due diligence. They're just following the respected rules of the United Nations regarding international law. So you can't even call that boycotting at all. But yet, in the UK, their policy has moved and moved and moved and moved. They'll still spout, oh yes, we believe in a two-state solution. Well, but you don't recognize both states. How can you have a two-state solution if you're not recognizing both states? So we have very much a two-faced, hypocritical approach to this, which the current crisis has really brought to light and made obvious when you watch Westminster, when you listen to Starmer, when you listen to David Lammy.
I mean, do you think that Netanyahu does have the support of ordinary Israelis still? I mean, I know the government was in and out of power. He's there in a coalition with even further right, as it were, or extreme Israeli parties.
No, I don't think ordinary Israelis support Netanyahu, which is one of the reasons why he didn't want to end the war, because when the war would end, there would be an election and he would be out. Obviously, ordinary Israelis, they get the media that they are fed. So the vast majority of Israelis would support the war, and obviously very much the narrative there is this is the only way to get the hostages back, and this is the way to end the terrorism. Well, no, it's not. You're actually generating new generations of terrorists, in the sense that, people who've lost their family are going to grow up with such a bitterness. I mean, I'm from Belfast. The biggest recruiter to the IRA was Bloody Sunday, and that was 14 people dead. So you can imagine what 60,000 people dead does. The only way to achieve peace both for Israelis and Palestinians, is to negotiate a just settlement and a just peace. And there are people in Israel who see that. And there are, charities and NGOs in Israel who campaign for that. I even met a couple of former diplomats, Israeli diplomats, who are part of a group campaigning for a just peace, because they said, actually, that's the only way our country's ever going to survive, is if we recognize that we need to accept Palestinian sovereignty and have a just peace. But that number is quite small, and if you're being fed on the news all the time,
yes,
the kind of anti-Palestinian narrative, that there are no civilians in Gaza, they are human animals, we need to wipe the place clean, then we can go back and resettle, etc. If you're being fed that every night on television, then obviously that impacts on opinion. Yeah. Haaretz, their newspaper, is quite balanced, and there's a small online news, Plus 972, where, like yourselves, they give online narratives of what's happening, which is very good. But the vast majority of people in Israel don't support Netanyahu, but they do support the war.
The economy in Israel is pretty much of a mess now, isn't it? I mean, that you'd think that would be undermining.
You've got hundreds of thousands of men who are serving as IDF soldiers in Gaza, who have had to come out of the economy. And I think, when you see some of the atrocities that IDF soldiers have shared themselves on TikTok and social media, you also have to think about what's it going to be like when they try to go back into normal society. So the idea that this is a win for Israel, there are countries in the world, there's politicians in the world who would have previously been generally pro-Israel, who feel they can't defend it now. There are companies who will not want to deal with Israel now. And there are people within Israel, families, communities, who are going to be literally torn apart by the kind of, traumatized and trauma-inducing actions of soldiers themselves, and then carrying that back. We've seen that in every war. But when you are in a space where there are no rules of engagement, where you are allowed to do anything, to torture, to, shoot children in the head for target practice, all of the things they have shared themselves online, and then they are meant to go back to normal life and work in an office. So Israel's economy is in a mess because of the cost, because of the men who are serving and the women who are serving in Gaza, but also they are storing up this incredible social network damage that is coming actually when soldiers return to normal. And of course, we are seeing it switching to the West Bank in what's being called the Gazification of the West Bank, the bombing of Tulkarem, the bombing of Jenin. For them, in some ways, the West Bank is an even bigger prize than Gaza.
But is there anything to be gained by, I won't pick up produce in the supermarket now if it's come from Israel, and it's a tiny little personal token protest. And I used to do that with South Africa back in the day as well. Does that kind of thing have any impact, or does it just make you feel slightly better yourself?
I think everybody doing their little mite, even if it does just make you feel better, there's nothing wrong with that. What you find is sometimes it's quite hard to identify Israeli produce. Before the current crisis, I would have been very much wanting to not purchase anything that was from settlements. But again, that's not marked out. So therefore, your only way of avoiding that is to avoid Israeli produce. But I think there will be people who in the past would not have wanted to support the full boycott, disinvestment, sanction approach, who would now, because they see, well, how else can I deal with it? And I think there will be big companies who will have to think about, okay, we are doing business with settlements, we invest in settlements, or we invest in Israel, etc. What is the damage to us as a company? And I think there will be these decisions in boardrooms. And this is what I mean, that actually in the longer term, Israel's position in the world and the international community will become harder for them. They think they're winning if they drive people out of Gaza or whatever. Oh, this is a big win for us. And of course, part of the wanting Gaza is the oil and gas that's been discovered off the Gaza coast, which of course Israel is aiming to lay claim to. So they will see just that they gain, but I don't think there's any insight in this incredibly right-wing government as to the losses that Israel faces. Just the damage of their own society. There's a group called Breaking the Silence, and that was former IDF soldiers who were traumatized by the change in rules of engagement in 2014, where it now was much more attacking civilians, and they struggled with that afterwards, and they formed a charity which is very active, but they really struggle in Israel because they're looked upon as if they were traitors. But the rules of engagement in this war have been way beyond that. And what's important to consider is the not just indiscriminate, it's actually deliberately destructive. So there's a lot of use of AI. And so there's an AI system called Lavender, which identifies targets, and apparently identified 37,000 Hamas operatives. Now that appears to have included doctors, university lecturers, deans, etc. So people who were working for the, if you like, the civilian Hamas government running the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education, etc., were all just being classed as Hamas operatives, as opposed to, okay, here's Hamas gunmen, here's terrorists, here's violent, we're after them. And then when they would identify this, and there's been quite a lot of articles written about the lack of a human oversight to kind of rein in the AI, if you like. They changed what was considered the acceptable civilian loss to achieving the elimination of one target. So they massively increased the numbers of civilians who could be killed if you took out a target. And then they combine it with another AI called Daddy's Home, which is tracking mobile phones and actually attacking the target when they have arrived back home with their family, and therefore deliberately taking out more civilians, their own family. But because they live in apartment blocks, you've seen how apartment blocks have been taken down supposedly to take out one Hamas operative or even a commander, even a senior commander, and then you have 50, 60, 70 civilians who've been killed in that process. So this is one of the first of this kind of war, if you, I mean, it's so one-sided, it's almost not right to call it a war, but where we've seen AI literally kind of taking over and removing the thought process of a human to think about, okay, what about after the war? What about we actually want to protect hospitals or universities or whatever else? And it's that utterly indiscriminate nature of the slaughter in Gaza that is very hard to take when you're in touch with people on the ground. And the picture I sent you with all the photographs, that is a friend of ours from the early 90s, Dr. Abdulatif, who was the director of hospitals in Gaza. When I give my talks, I say they are not numbers. This was our friend Abdulatif lost 48 members of his family in one night when his house was bombed. It was supposedly in a safe area in the middle zone. It wasn't near anything else. I'd been there. It was a detached house with a big garden, no other targets nearby, and it was hit. Abdulatif survived because he was working in the hospital, but he lost 48 members of his family, including 3 children, 3 grandchildren. The youngest was 5 months old. And it's this indiscriminate nature. And I can't help but feel that his house was targeted because he worked in the Ministry of Health, the Hamas Ministry of Health. I mean, that's like saying in the 80s, I was a Thatcherite because I was a doctor in the NHS under the Conservative government, So it's quite bizarre to have removed the demarcation and this is Dima, this is his daughter, who was an Erasmus student at Glasgow University, and she worked for the World Health Organization limb reconstruction team in southern Gaza. This is last March. This is me. I'm propped up on one crutch at that time with very great difficulty, I can say. But I just had to go and speak out. I would be at healthcare vigils more often, but kind of standing and walking is difficult. This is when I got to go back to Ahli Arab Hospital in 2016. I had the chance with Medical Aid for Palestinians, and that was the charity we'd worked with in the early 90s. When I became an MP, I got the chance to return. By then, I purely had been doing breast cancer surgery, and they were normally much more trauma orientated, but they let me go on a scoping mission, and from that we set up a partnership between Gaza and Scotland. I recruited specialists all around Scotland who would work with colleagues in Gaza. We would do 2 training missions a year to Gaza. And we also linked every Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock online to discuss patients, exactly as we would do in a treatment meeting here. And our colleagues in Gaza, they transformed their service in a matter of 4 years. I mean, it was just fantastic. And this was the women's group in 2016 that I met in Barej refugee camp. And every woman I met in that week who'd had breast cancer had had a mastectomy. Every single one, no matter how early their cancer was. All of them had had what's called an axillary clearance, which is quite a radical surgery under your arm, and half of them had what's called lymphedema, which is a big, heavy, swollen arm. And that was why I thought, no, come on, we really need to move into the 21st century.
We'll put the link to a presentation you gave for Christians for India in the bottom of this, because you go into a lot of really fascinating detail about your times there, and it'd be really good if people would like to see that from this.
Just thinking about, going forward. I mean, there's Gaza. It's a pile of ruins. I mean, it surely does need some sort of modern Marshall Plan, the way that, well, I think it was the States, actually, wasn't it, that helped rebuild Europe after World War II. I mean, Trump obviously would like to have his Riviera and Trump Tower, so we're not going to, hopefully that the world can avoid that happening. But do you think some sort of Marshall Plan effect is possible?
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny you say that, because that's exactly the example that I've tended to use, that the international community would really need to massively rally round and commit for the long term. The problem is that you would need to be having some degree of stability and future. What we saw after the 2008-9 bombing is charities and international players were quite good at coming forward with money to rebuild, to restart projects, get clinics going again. But after 2014, some of the charities said it was much harder to get engagement, because there was well, what's the point? Well, why should we bother giving you money? It's all going to get bombed again in a couple of years' time. So there would need to be that underlying political agreement that recognizes that actually Israel has a lot to gain from peace, as well as the Palestinians. And the only way to get a peace that'll last is a just peace. But once you start to have that moving forward, you would need enormous investment. I mean, enormous investment. The scale, if you look at some of in that talk I gave, the satellite image showing the map of the destruction, and that was last March, so we're a long way on from that. I think there's probably not an undamaged building anywhere in Gaza. And there's a lot of areas that are literally razed to the ground. And on top of that is farms have been destroyed. Olive groves have been bombed. So, when we lived there, when I give a talk, I have a picture of my husband Hans at the fruit and veg shop, and there's tons of fruit and veg. There was no shortage of food. There was no hunger when we lived in Gaza in 91 and 92. Gaza would struggle to feed itself now. And so you really, the scale of the rebuilding is massive, and it therefore would need this coordinated multinational response and investment as part of an investment in a better future and a Palestinian state. We need countries to recognize Palestine, to accept that the only way you're going to have peace and not have World War III is to deal with the running sore that, as you said at the beginning, Marlene, has been going on for decades. And the international community just kept, they paid attention for a month when there was a crisis, and then they move on. This time we can't do that.
Yeah. The ceasefire that's in effect just now, then, are you hopeful that that's going to lead to something, or is it too fragile?
I think it is very fragile, and if you remember, it's in phases. Netanyahu boasts within Israel that Trump accepts that he can go back to fighting if he feels the need. It's clear that Trump wanted that for his inauguration. Oh, look, I have brought peace to Gaza and we have a ceasefire. But it is also clear that there is the backroom deal with Netanyahu that they can go back to fighting. And also this idea of literally just driving people out and ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip completely, which would inevitably be very violent. The idea that Gazans won't resist that is naive is too soft a word. So I worry that we might get to second stage. We might get a bit more of prisoner release and hostage release. But are we really going to get to some serious plateau that will lead us to future negotiations that are serious? Because there's no impression of that from Netanyahu, and obviously quite the opposite. The way the violence, which in 23 had been worse in the West Bank than in Gaza, but now was overshadowed by Gaza, but now is really literally within a few days of the ceasefire in Gaza. Suddenly the violence was full pelt in Jenin. We've seen them, destroying the roads, destroying the infrastructure, bombing, etc. And it literally is this Gazification of the West Bank. And so it's hard not to give in to despair, but equally despair is cheating. We are all responsible for the planet while we live on it. So even if we can only do our tiny wee bit, as you were saying, Fiona, we have to do it. So whether we're writing to our MPs, whether we're writing to Starmer and Lamy, whether we're donating funds to charities that are working in the occupied territories, whether we're on marches or vigils, if we don't do our bit, then we are all negligent and in fighting this. And we need to be doing that, because what Trump is doing, I mean, even inside America, the destruction and undermining of democracy and government in America is, I mean, to be honest, that has really shocked me. And then the threats to his neighbors, Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Panama, and then we're just going to take over Gaza. We won't put any soldiers there. I don't know where he gets that idea from, but we will turn it into new property boom, as you say, a waterfront Riviera. I mean, it's
sickening. What about yourself? I mean, I know you've got connections with the Medical Aid for Palestine kind of charity, but that doesn't look like there's anything to go back to in Palestine, like a hospital or a clinic. But I mean, do you see yourself going back?
Well, there actually, I mean, there are people who are doing that. I mean, I hope I will get a chance to go back to Gaza. I am hoping to become more involved in medical aid for Palestinians now that I'm retired and have reached out to try and do that in the future. I managed with one of our members of the Scottish Palestinian Health Partnership, which we launched last April, which is others like me who have worked in the occupied territories, many of them recruited to that breast cancer project I mentioned, which started the following year in the West Bank, and then other specialties followed the same model. So we actually have quite a lot of Scottish Palestine partnerships in different specialties. So we managed to make contact with the radiologist who had been part of our breast cancer project in Gaza. Sadly, many members of the team are dead, or we simply have no idea what has happened to them. But the Ministry of Health kind of last October-ish set up a new breast cancer team in Nasser Hospital in Han Yunis. and they are running clinics. They now have set aside a theatre so that can actually get women into surgery. And they are actually delivering a service way beyond what I could have thought they would have, I could have imagined that they could do, but there's lots of things they can't get, medical supplies. So we had an online meeting on the 22nd of December with all the members of this new multidisciplinary team, and I sent a report to MAP of, here's the amazing stuff they're doing, but here's a shopping list of what they desperately need. And obviously it's a question as to whether MAP can get those things into them. So I'm hoping that both through online support and discussions, and also eventually actually specialist colleagues going back out with MAP to Gaza, that we can get these services up, because otherwise you're dooming people with heart disease, diabetes, cancer, all of which has been neglected for the last 16 months. These people will die for lack of treatment. And they are also deaths as a result of this war. So the challenge is eye-watering, but certainly it is something that I hope to be involved in to the best of my ability going forward.
And we'll put the link to MAP as well on the screen and in the notes, and if people want to donate to that, obviously a very, very good cause. Okay, well, wow, I feel as if we've had an absolute immersion over the last 50 minutes in something that otherwise you barely scratch the surface of. So it must be painful for you to talk about some of these things, Philippa, but very much appreciate that you have shared that with us, because it's just so valuable to get that first-hand knowledge. And these are not numbers, these are human beings.
When I spoke at the Healthcare Workers Vigil, I read out some of the texts that Abdul Latif sent me the next morning, and I can hardly read it out, basically. And certainly at the height, when the ground invasion started, when these things were happening, there were lots of nights where you just couldn't sleep. I mean, I have friends who've been driven out of Gaza. I've got friends who are in tents or shelters in Mawazi. I've got friends that have no idea where they are. And you hope that they're not answering the WhatsApp message because they've no power or they've no signal, but obviously you don't know. And sitting at night, particularly in the early months, sometimes in bed, flicking between your phone, your WhatsApp, social media, and praying, and then phone, social media, praying, WhatsApp, just all night, just not able to sleep.
Remember, it was so like that for Humza as well, and with his parents.
His family were there.
Happened to be caught up in that, but
obviously Nadia. I mean, obviously it was Nadia's parents, but obviously her wider family are there. So that's even harder for them than for me. I mean, this is friends and colleagues, but some, like Abdul Latif, people that I've known for decades, and we are in touch with some through WhatsApp, that you hear what's going on. And of course, as I said, if you watch what people load up directly to internet or some of the kind of local Gazan journalists, then what you see is really so different from what is being presented to the public here. I mean, I loved living in Gaza in 91 and 92. I mean, it was hard work, I mean, it was 6 days a week and on duty every other night and dealing with emergencies. This is me with Dr. Ali and Omar in the garden. This was one of the few green spaces that people could access in Gaza City, and was the waiting room. There was no appointment system. They would call the name, the patient, their relatives and the patients would all just sit in the garden until it was their turn. But the Palestinians are incredibly hospitable and welcoming. And, I felt, being Irish, there was really quite a lot of parallels in the culture. Very much family, hospitality, music, lively friendliness. I loved living in Gaza, and Hans had arranged a job to come back to on Mull to do his GP trainee year, or I mean, I'd have been happy to have stayed longer. But obviously what they've been through in the last 16 months, it's been heartbreaking. I mean, it's heartbreaking for me. And, you know, I'm going to bed in a warm, comfortable bed, and I can't help but think about that every night, the situation that they're in, and that suffering over so long, such extreme suffering for such a long time. And the international community have stood back and let it happen, or have even been pouring petrol on the fire by selling.
Which undermines the whole purpose of having any kind of international law, doesn't it, if it can't do anything? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. This has been just fascinating to listen to, but in a sort of heart-wrenching way, if I can say that.
You're very welcome, and it's been lovely to speak to both of you again.
When you listen to someone who's lived in the country over that length of time, who's got all those contacts, who's been, you know, ensconced in setting something up, and for them to see that work be destroyed, which is not to say that it can't arise again, but it must be heartbreaking. Well, no doubt with a lot of other emotions. And actually, I found some of what she said was quite chilling, particularly in terms of how the Israelis have targeted Palestinians.
But the use of AI, that was horrible.
You know, as we said, during that, Philippa herself has done a lot of fundraising for, medical aid for Palestinians. If any of you, having or listened to the podcast, can give a bit of money to MAP, we'll put the link up, and you can do that.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.